Welcome to Stories of the Free. Today's story takes place in 1804 follows Tobias, the impossible story of a black boy who lived inside the Destrehan Plantation, in a place where he was never intended to be. What happened there was had for a reason, and one truth could end up costing his life. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a breath and listen closely. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment the city and country you're listening from. Your birthday helps make sure these stories are remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. In 1804, on a sugar plantation 40 miles from New Orleans, something took place that no one could explain. A black child, no older than self, was discovered dead inside the manhouse of the Destrehan Plantation. Not in the slave quarters, not in the fields, not in the kitchen band the sewer slave workers cooked for the white family. He was found inside the mansion itself, killed beneath a mahogany table the grand boiler. His small frame was pressed against the cold wood floor. The overseer came across him that morning as his opposite senator twice. But before the laser could strike the boy's skin, a fee stopped him cold. With it. That face belonged to Marie Celeste Robe-Blockney Destrehan, the lady of the house. And what she did next to the start a chain of offenses that would reverberate through history for more than 10 years. This is the story of Tobias, a boy who was never meant to burn any record. A boy whose name was the rest from the plantation ledgers. A boy who so secret that the wealthy sugar planters of Louisiana wanted buried for code. But the truth has a way surface, if one bearfulman trade destroy. The Destrehan Plantation sat on the east bank of the Mississippi River, in a ridge French Spanish colonizers called the Germ Coast. The name came from Germ immigrants who had settled there as 17 long before sugar became king. By 1804, the area had become one of the most profitable stretches of land in the entire Louisiana territory. General Destrehan was a magazine seized man's rage. His plantation turned out more than 10,000 bands of sugar each year. That number did mean much to most people. But to grasp what it truly represented, you have to understand what sugar demand. Sugar cane isn't like coat or tobacco. It won't was it. Once the cane is kept, it has to be processed in a matter of hours, or the sucrose sits out to break down. This means that door half these, enslaved workers labor around the clock. 18 hours, 20 hours, sometimes more. The slash the cane was much as under the brutal Louisiana sun. They fed the socks into grinder mills of by mules or by their own worn bodies. They boiled the juice and massacred tails, stirred constantly as the liquid dust the crystals. The heat from those kettles could reach 250 درجة. Burns or calm. Deaths were not rare, and the cycle never stopped until the last stock was processed. In 1804, 59 slave يوم بينزل دان أربردون the Destrehan property. 59 people rose before dawn and collapsed after dark. 59 people whose labor bit the wealth that led General Destrehan bought up his grand house with calories and cypress columns. Tobias was not one of those 59. He seemed to come from nowhere, or at least, that's what the records suggest. There was no bill of sale document or his purchase. No inventory listed his reef. He simply materialized on that October morning in 1804, a coast shield in a house built on the bones of his people. The overseer's name was Clement Rossard. He was a Creole man of French descent, thick-necked and quick-tanker, known abandoned the Germ Coast for his efficiency at forced labor from slave workers. When he found the boy under the boiler table, his first instinct was fearless. That was always his first instinct. But Marie Celeste sobbed him. She was 43 that year, the daughter of a wealthy planter family, educated with most of her time. She had married General when she was barely 16, and she had spent nearly 13 years running the domestic side of the plantation. She knew every slave birth by name. She knew which ones could be trusted with household duties and which one needed watching. She understood the rhythms of the sugar harvest and the economics of human bondage. What she didn't know was why this child had a bird in her home. Where did you come from? She asked. Neelert meet the boy's days. Tobias de tenser? Echo de tenser. His tunnel had been damaged somehow, whether by accident or deliberate cruelty, no one could tell. He communicated with gestures, with expressions, with a kind of silent language Marie Celeste van der Safra and the weeks that followed. The logical son would have been to send him to the quarters, set him to work with the other children whole of water or chase of birds from the fields or do the seasoned small task plantation of cafetinas. That was what Clement Bossard wanted. That was what Jean or the strong backed. But Marie Celeste made a different choice. She kept him in the heads. This decision took the free social role of the time. Slash the people or property. They were tools. They weren't supposed to share the same spaces as their owners, except condone specific duties. A black child saber in the grand boiler was encouraged the planter class, a flash of the natural order they had to justify their ways. Yet Marie Celeste kept him in new. The official explanation, when questions came up, was that the boy served as a company for the Destrehan children. Jean and Marie Celeste had several sons and daughters, and it was a completely new job for wealthy families to send slave children as diplomats for their own kids. This practice served a number of purposes. It kept at the plantation children company. It sorted the process of condition the slave children for a less team restored. And it reinforced the hierarchy from the least possible age, teaching which children to command and black children to obey. But Tobias was different. He didn't obey. The first son of his defense came was an week of his discovery. One of the Destrehan sons, a boy of name Nicholas, had taken tormentor Tobias on for the death or torture. He wouldn't shame, pull his hair, kick dirt on his foot. These were common behaviors of planter children, who learn cruelty as naturally as they learned to talk. One afternoon, Nicholas pushed Tobias into the mud behind the kitchen dependency. He laughed as Tobias circled trays, his small body coated in the sick Louisianers. Then he pushed him again. What happened next was seen by a slave woman named Josephine, worked in the kitchen. She would later tell the story to her children, who would pass it out to the others, who would eventually share it with the story in searching for pieces of the past. Tobias rose from the mud. He looked at Nicholas with eyes that had no fear. And then he smiled. It wasn't a submissive smile. It wasn't the smile of a child seeking reproof or trainer to defuse a dangerous situation. It was Samasras entirely. Samasras that made Nicholas step back without understand the way. Then Tobias walked away. He walked past Nicholas, past the kitchen, past the slave quarters, and straight towards the manhouse. He walked through the front door, which is left people were forbidden to use. He walked across the saber floors, leaving the footprints with a free sub. And he walked into the parlor, where Marie Celeste sat reading correspondence from New Orleans. She looked up at the mud-covered sheet standing before her. She looked at the trail of dirt he had tracked through her home. And according to Josephine the Kant, she did something remarkable. She laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not a dismissive laugh, but a genuine sign of amusement, as if the boy had pulled off some clever trick that led to her. Well, she said, set aside her letters, it seems you have something to tell me. And from that moment, something shifted the Destrehan household. General Destrehan was a sentimental man. He had been born into wealth, educated in commerce and law. And he understood that his prosperity depended on the brutal machinery of slavery. He didn't question the system, because the system benefited him. He didn't see enslaved people as for a young, because acknowledging their humanity would have made his whole existence unconscionable. But even the general could ignore what was happened with Tobias. The boy had a gift. Or maybe gift isn't the right word. He had an ability no one could explain. He knew things he shouldn't have known, things he couldn't have known. The first instance the general saw was on this came in November 1804. He had expected a shipment of supplies from New Orleans, a flatboat carrying tools, fabric, and provisions for the coming winter. The boat was towed as late, and the general was scared worried. River travel was dangerous. Pirates operated along certain stretches. akassedetshabend. Tobias kam ab tom onze kalere overloken subdi. The boy bunted den refertold New Orleans. Then he held up 3 finakers. Digino al dismissed the gesture. The boy was simple-minded, some damaged was that went beyond his inability to speak. 3 days later, the flatboat arrived. It had been delayed below water near Baton Rouge. Digino al might have bought the dot coincides. He probably would have forgot it entirely, if the Samson hadn't have the Dickennekan. Tobias no one storms or come before clad as a bird on the horizon. He no one is left workers or bland tram before the their move. He no one visitors would arrive from New Orleans, sometimes doesn't pass. He couldn't explain how he knows this and us. He could only point and gesture and hope someone would understand. Marie Celeste understood. She started keeping a journal of Tobias's predictions. She recorded each one with the precision of a scientist running experiment. Date, prediction, come. Over 6 months, she documented 47 instances where Tobias had accurately foretold events before they happened. 44 of those predictions came true. The journal would survive. It was likely destroyed in the years after 1811, when the events of the germ costa breeze led fulfillment to Bernice that might connect them to what had happened. But its existence was confirmed by multiple sources, including letters Marie Celeste sent to her sister in New Orleans. What was Tobias? This coast haunted the Destrehan South throughout 1805. Some of the enslaved workers believed he was touched by spirits, blessed or cursed with second sea. Others who supposed he wasn't entirely human, that maybe he had been born in the swamps, a mother who had met deals with forces beyond understanding. The wet residents of neighboring plantations had their own theories, most for demon Kbzash or Africa. The truth, as far as it can be pieced together, was probably simpler. Tobias was exceptionally drift. He noticed battles as others missed. He watched animals behave before storms. He studied the faces of enslaved workers and caught the subtle signs of desperation that come before escape attempts. He predicted the rhythm of river traffic and learned to predict rifles based on seasonal patterns. His cell sourced him to communicate through observation. As that observation became his bearer. But bearer, if the bearer of a mute left shield, was dangerous in 1804 Louisiana, especially for a black boy from a white man's house. The trouble started with the neighbors. Jacques Fortier owned a plantation a few miles downriver from the Destrehans. He was a friend of Jean Wales, a fellow member of the Planter and a man who believed deeply in the proper order of society. When he heard rumors about the strange children from the Destrehan, he came to investigate. What he found disgusted him. Tobias was seated at a small table in the corner of the dining room, eating from a ceramic plate while the Destrehan family had their evening meal. This was unprecedented. Enslaved people did it in the same room as their owners. They certainly did it at the same time, from the same dishes, prepared by the same hands. Noel, Fortier said, his face was controlled and care. Mate, I have a word. The conversation that followed took place on the gallery, that a show of the family, but limited sword, the overseer, was standing nearby. He heard the freeze, and he would later use what he heard advance his own position. This can't continue, Fortier said. You're making a mockery of a freeze with but hair. Noel tried to explain. The boy was youthful, cute, his abilities had proved valuable for predict other and manager labor. Keeping him closer led the family to benefit from his strange gifts. Fortier was at convinced. You're teaching him his equal, Fortier said. You're showing a free slave on this coast that a black child can sit at a white man's table. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what happens when they start to believe they deserve the same treatment? Noel understood? He had grown up in this system. He not survived depended on absolute hierarchy, or the constant reinforcement of white superiority and lack inferiority. Every male to be set in that dining room was a crack in the foundation. Betty was so no what as with would self-hatred and the Marie-Celeste had become attached to base and was diginal coded for the castle. She spoke to him as if he could respond. She taught him letters and numbers, scratching them in the dirt of the corridor no one else was watching. She protected him from the casual failures that defined life on the plantation. تبغن ونفركمت بوصردور أن يزروت برسرز هاندكنستم. This attachment was dangerous, not just for Tobias, but for Marie-Celeste herself. Of her class were expected to keep emotion distance from the enslaved people around. أفكش was وكان سنفيت الكاوس. Diginal decided compromise. Tobias would stand the house, but he would no longer create with the family. He would sit in a small room next to the kitchen, not the main house. He would perform duties appropriate to his stash, fetisher, cariner, cleaner, and he would never, under any circumstances, be treated as an equal. Marie-Celeste created these terms, but she did not follow them. The secret secrecy went on. Marie-Celeste had taught 3 of her own children to read, and she used the same methods with Tobias. Within a year, he could recognize most commands. Within 2 years, he could read simple texts, though he communicated his understanding only through gestures and nods. This was illegal. Louis Villanox bestie prohibited teachers left people trade or rape. The penalty for failure was severe. Enslaved individuals could be whipped, mutilated, or killed. White people who facilitated literacy faced fines and imprisonment. The law existed because the founders understood a fundamental truth. Literacy was a barrier. Enslaved persons who could read could access information. They could communicate in secret. They could organize. They could resist. Marie-Celeste knows the law. She broke it anyway. Oui. This question has buzzed historians for generations. Somehow for killed she was motivated by Christian charity, a desire to serve the boys also education. Others have suggested more practical reasons, that a letter itself might prove useful for complex household management. Still others have proposed that Marie-Celeste simply saw some 70 base that went beyond the categories of her time, a spark of intelligence and will that needed return. The truth probably included the limits of all these explanations. Your motivation is rarely simple. Whatever reasons, Marie-Celeste's strategic shift to base would have consequences neither of them could foresee. In this paragraph 1806, enough appeared on the germ coast. His name was Charles Destrehan, and he arrived at the plantation of Zodo de Zera, next to the property of Manuel Ondra. He was a mixed man in his late teens or late 20s, brought from Saint Domingue, the island that had recently become the independent nation of Haiti. The Ashraf had terrified with the folders throughout the Americas. For the first time in history, enslaved people had successfully overthrown their masters and established their owners. The revolution had been filled beyond imagination. Thousands of white colonists had been killed. Plantations had burned. The entire social order had been abandoned. Refugees from Saint Domingue brought more than their possessions to Louisiana. They brought stories. And among the enslaved people that transported, they brought revolutionary ideas. Charles Destrehan was one of those transported individuals. He worked as a ref from Manuel Ondra's plantation, a position that gave him authority over other slave workers. Drivers were usually chosen for their intelligence and their ability to command respect. They occupied the ubiquitous space between the slave masses and the white bar structure. Trusted enough to supervise labor, but never trusted enough to be free. Destrehan had witnessed the harsh revolution. He had seen what was possible when enslaved people united against their oppressors, and he began slowly and carefully to spread those ideas over the germ coast. Tobias met Destrehan for the first time in June 1806. The meeting happened by accident. General Destrehan had business with Manuel Ondra, some sort of sugar braces and Abra cash. He brought Tobias along because Marie-Celeste insisted the boy needed fresh air, and because Tobias's predictions had proved useful for cadres the trust origins of business partners. At Ondra's plantation, Tobias wandered away from the main house. While their dads conducted their affairs, hekse blood the crandos the quick curiosity that morte fries and headed, watcher zorkers in the fields, the toes in the sheded, the rhythms of labor that defend Banta life. He van des lands near the slave quarters, speaked quickly with a club of Yenama. The conversation stopped when Tobias approached. The man looked at him with suspicion. A child from another plantation, especially one who served the white family, could be SB. Information had value, and the trail could mean death. But the silent studied Tobias carefully. He noticed the intelligence in the boy's eyes. He observed how Tobias stood, not with the hunched posture submission that most enslaved children adopted, but brother. You don't speak, Desland said. It wasn't a question. Tobias shook his head. But you less. Tobias nodded. Desland smiled. It was a cautious smile, cold, but genuine. Listeners are fallible, he said. Speakers get themselves killed. Listeners their faith. This brief exchange would prove prophetic was neither of them could have imagined. The summer of 1896. Temperatures claimed above درجة and the humidity made their feel like we close breastic into the stone. The slash workers collapsed in the fields. Today on the Destrehan property lawn, their bodies covered under the combined sort of heat and labor. Tobias had been most of that summer inside the manhouse, where sick was than he still offered summer life from the breath of weather. Marie-Celeste continued as education, moving to more complex texts and introduced the secrecy. She started teaching him trade, cadre his hand across by bird form letters and words. This was the most dangerous phase of his secret schooling. Reader could be concealed. A boy could be caught with a book and claim he was just looking at the pictures. But later was deliberate. Later was intentional. Later was unmistakably a fact of education. Tobias understood the risk. He practiced only in brief, destroy a free deliberation as the lesson. He never wrote in the praise of anyone but Marie-Celeste. He never gave any sign that he possessed this forbidden skill, intelligence said it was claimed through sword. It happened in August, during the height of half the preparations. Broussard had been reckon, as he of the doing the pressure of his position became too great. He was responsible for extracting maximum labor from 59 enslaved human beings. And that responsibility was on him as he couldn't admit. So he drank, and when he drank, he became fail. That even he came across the base near the kitchen dependency. The boy was carrying a bucket of water, down one of the menial tasks sent just for his braces in the household. Broussard blocked his bath. You think you're special? Broussard said, his old city said. You think because Madame protects you, you're different from the rest of them. Tobias didn't respond. He couldn't respond. But he met Broussard's eyes that flinched. This was a mistake. Enslaved people were expected to look down and confronted the weights. Direct contact was a troubled as challenge, as defense, as a refusal to accept one's place in the hierarchy. Tobias had spent too much time with Marie-Celeste, who encouraged him to meet her cause when she spoke. He had forgot the rules that covered his interactions with everyone else. Broussard's hands shot at and grabbed Tobias by the throat. The beak clattered the ground, water splashed across the batters. You look at me like that again, Broussard hissed, and I will kill you. I don't care what Madame says. I don't care what the master says. You are property. You are nothing. And I will remind you of that every day for the rest of your miserable life. He shifted base, another the boy's problem. Then he walked away, left the base castle in the dirt. This encounter changed Samasar and Tobias. He had experienced cruelty before. He had seen Phila second desert enslaved people throughout his time at Destrehan. But this was the first time Philas had been directed specifically at him. The first time he had felt the weight of his opposition this brutal system. That night, he did something he had never done before. He wrote on a stab of paper stolen from Marie-Celeste's desk, using a stab of pencil he had in his library. He wrote 3 words, I will remember. I didn't know what those words meant. I didn't know what he intended to remember, or what he planned to do with that memory. But that afraid rhythm transformed something abstract into something concrete. His suffer had been recorded. His determination had been documented. His humanity had been certed in the only medium available to him. He buried the paper immediately afterward, watching the flames consume his words. But that itself could have been that. He had read. He had expressed himself in the language of his oppressors. He had claimed a paper they had traded in him. And he would not forget. The autumn of 1806 brought a visitor to the Destrehan Plantation. His name was John Baptiste Lobatte, and he was one of the most prominent lawyers in New Orleans. He lived on a flat bubbled with legal documents and a mission that would reshape the trajectory of the entire age. President Thomas Jefferson had bought the Louisiana Territory from France just 3 years earlier. The legal status of the region remained chaotic. Spanish law still covered many aspects of daily life. French customs persisted in social interactions, and American deals, especially recorded the expansion of slavery, or began to reshape the political landscape. Lobatte had been hired by a consortium of sugar planters, including the Untold Destrehan, to ensure their property rights would be protected under the new American administration. This meant navigating a complex web of computer legal systems, validating land grants, confirming ownership of enslaved people, and setting up the mechanisms by which the planter class would maintain its power. Tobias was a president and several of Lobatte's meters was the Untold. His role was ostensibly to serve refreshments, but Marie Celeste had blessed him deliberately. She wanted to know what was being discussed. She wanted to understand the political currents that would shape her family's future. Tobias observed all of those meetings would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lobatte spoke casually about the slave population. He used numbers and percentages, discussing young beginners as if there were livestock or machinery. He calculated the value of different categories of workers. Brimfeed hands, skilled artisans, hazards, children, of cheap beverage. Each category had a price. Each price could be negotiated. Each negotiation was conducted with the code precision of men who had consented themselves or engaged in ordinary commerce. But one conversation stood out above the rest. The numerous are concerned about insurrection, Lobatte said, several that Tobias had board moments here. They've heard about what happened in Dominica. They're worried the Samson could happen here. Did you know carefully? We all worry about that. This loses control, Lobatte continued. Absolute control. The moment you allow them to believe they have any power, any autonomy, any hope of change, you've lost. You must break them completely. Not just their bodies, but their spirits. They must believe in the deepest part of themselves that they are meant to serve, that they are incapable of any service, that freedom is not just impossible but unattainable. He paused, surrounded his bandy. That's why literacy is so dangerous. That's why we can never let them trade. Or else give them ideas. Ideas give them hope. Hope gives them courage. And courage makes them dangerous. Tobias stood perfectly still throughout this speech, his face expressionless, his posture submissive. He gave no indication he understood what was being said. He gave no sign he could read the document spread across the table. He was invisible in the way all slaves felt or expected to be invisible. But inside, something was burning. He hadn't trade busy for a woman who profited from his slavery. He had been kept the cuff Lobatte declared most dangerous. And he understood why. Not just the practical reasons, but the philosophical foundations of the system that imprisoned him. They were afraid. Behind all their power, behind all their wealth, behind all their feelings, they were afraid. They knew their system was built on lies. They knew enslaved people were not inferior, not incapable, not meant to serve. They knew the only sin maintain their position was force. And they know that if enslaved people have realized their own strength, if free would collapse. This knowledge did it bring Tobias joy. It did it bring him hope. It brought him some more complex, harder to know. It brought him overruns. He saw the system clearly for the first time. Saw its brutality and its fragility. Saw that it result motivated defenders and the feelings that sustained. And he began to understand that change was possible. Not today, not tomorrow, maybe not even his lifetime, but possible. The winter of 1806 was made by Louisiana standards, which meant the enslaved population had a bit more energy than usual for activities beyond the required labor. On Sunday evenings, one customer had a few hours of rest, clubs would gather in the quarters share news, tell stories, and keep belief the cultural traditions that connected them to Africa and each other. Tobias started to attend these gatherings. He was accepted because he was young, and cause his sailors made him seem harmless. They spoke freely in his prayers, shared information that would never have revealed a speaker child who might accidentally repeat what he'd heard. Through these gatherings, Tobias learned about the network that linked the slave communities across the Durham coast. He learned that information traveled faster among the slaves than among the planters. That news of scabs, punishments, and desperate was in a resolute channels with people never suspected. He learned about the Morons, the communities of Scabs who lived in the swamps, survived by hunter, fishing, and red race-led plantations. And he learned about Charles Deslands. Deslands had become a legend among the slave population. He was said to be fearless. He was said to have connection to Haiti, leaders who had actually overthrown the white masters and taken control of their owners. He was said to be blasphemous, though no one knew exactly what. Tobias listened to all of this. He felt to in the symbol of his made where he stood with their battles, referred traffic, and the set expressions that predicted human behavior. He didn't know how or when this information might become useful, but he knew it had value, and he kept on learning. Marie Celeste's lessons grew more sophisticated as 1807 approached. She began teaching Tobias geography, showing him maps of Louisiana, of the United States, of the world beyond. She explained the political situation, the tensions between different factions for control of the territory. She discussed the economy, her sugar braces rose and fell based on the state of in Europe and the Caribbean. She was educated him deliberately and thoroughly to understand the world that enslaved him. Oui. This quest became more pressing as the story continues. Marie Celeste was not an abolitionist. She owned the enslaved people and benefited enormously from their labor. She had no intention of freeing Tobias or anyone else. Her entire way of life depended on the continuous slavery. Yet she dedicated years to cover this and she had the intellectual tools to comprehend the situation. Some historians have suggested she was simply bored. Wealthy women at plantations had limited outlets for their intelligence, and teachers might have offered stimulation she couldn't feed elsewhere. There's a purpose she saw Tobias as a kind of experiment, a test of what enslaved people might achieve if given some advantages as with children. But there is another possibility, one that emerges from the fragments of evidence that survive. Marie Celeste knew the system was unsustainable. She had read the reports from Sandominka. She understood the mathematics of British, the way a small white population could only control a large slave population through constant fearless and perpetual vigilance. She had seen the brutality of crime to a certain man like him, the casual cruelty required to maintain order, and she suspected that eventually, inevitably, the slave population would rise. When that happened, she wanted someone who might remember her differently. Not as a slaveholder, not as a oppressor, but as a human being who had read, not for small oil, acknowledge the humanity of those she enslaved. It was not justice. It was not redemption. It was something smaller and more self, a desperate attempt salved some fragment of her legacy from the moral catastrophe in which she was embedded. And it would not be enough. The year 1807 brought intensified tensions to the Durham coast. The American authorities were taking their control over the territory, imposing no regulations that restricted the movement of enslaved people and increased punishments for various offenses. At the same time, the enslaved population was grown. Sugar required labor, and labor required bodies, and bodies were imported in ever increasing numbers from Africa and the Caribbean. More bodies meant more potential for resistance. The general Destrehan responded to this threat by increasing security on his property. He had additional patrollers, with maneuvered the roads at night looking for escapees. He built stronger locks on these quarters. He told claimed to use harsher punishments for minor infractions. The atmosphere on the plantation grew high fear. Slave workers who had once moved with some freedom now found themselves under constant surveillance. Conversations were monitored. Cases were dispersed. This undefined in the quarters were banditry. Tobias felt the change more acutely than most. His possessions had become increasingly precarious. The general started question why the boy was still there, why he had been sent to the field and that he was old enough for physical labor. L'animed bossad ladly advocate for his removal, or Kionr has continued his undermined discipline of the slave workers. Marie-Celeste defended him, but her orkium zur Convoker. The biblical climate had shifted. The tolerance that had led to base terminziha sozifa beretta. In September 1807, the general made his decision. Tobias would be sold. Marie-Celeste learned of this plan by accident. She offered her husband discussed terms with a slave trader from Natchez, a man known for being shoulder and transport them to plantations in the interior. The prices were good. The market was strong. There was no reason to keep a new boy who contributed necessary to the household. She confronted the general that if in the brief see their bedchamber. You cannot sell him, she said. He is a property, the general replied. I can do whatever I wish with him. Here is a shield. Here is a salaf. There is no difference. Marie-Celeste had never directly challenged her husband's authority. The social conventions of her team made such challenges almost unsinkable. A wife was expected to defer to her husband in all significant matters, to manage her domain without question his decisions. But this was different. If you sell him, she said, I will never forgive you. The general looked at his wife with an expression that combined surprise, anger, and sense that might have been fear. In 27 years of marriage, she had never spoken to him this way. What is it you? The general demanded. Why does this boy matter more than the 50 others we own? Why do you protect him so fiercely? Marie-Celeste did not answer. Perhaps she couldn't answer. Perhaps the reasons were too complex, too tangled, too shameful to articulate. The general made his own interpretation. You've grown too touch, he said coldly. It's unhealthy. It's dangerous. And it isn't. He left the room that waited for a response. Marie-Celeste sat low for a long time after he left. She thought about Tobias. She thought about the years she had spent teaching him, the knowledge of secret lessons, the low accumulation of knowledge she had poured into his silent mind. She thought about the system that made him property and her complicit in his enslavement. And she made a decision that would change everything. She would not let General sell Tobias. She would not let the boy disappear into the brutal machinery the cold frontier. She would find another way. The plan Marie-Celeste came up with was desperate, dangerous, and almost certainly illegal. But she had resources most of her team didn't. She had education. She had connections. And she had some صغار husband did for البريشية. She had land. Under Louisiana's civil law, married mertenser property rates that didn't exist in common states. Marie-Celeste had inherited a small parcel of land from her father. Land that remained likely separate from her husband's estate. This land included no enslaved people. It produced no sugar. It had almost no economic value, but it belonged to her. On September 23, 1807, Marie-Celeste did something extraordinary. She drafted a document in her own hand, declared that she was transferring ownership of the enslaved child known as Tobias to herself, using funds from her personal property. She recorded a fiction British press. She created a property that would make the transaction look legitimate. Then she had the document where no one would think it look. This was fraud. This was forgery. This was a crime that could result in significant penalties if discovered. But Marie Celeste calculated that her husband would never examine the legal details closely enough to detect the deception. He would simply accept that the boy had been removed from his story and some the cell had gone through as planned. She was wrong. Claimed Brossard found the document. He had been searching Marie Celeste's brief chambers on the general's orders, looking for a fit of improper behavior that might justify more drastic cash. What he found was far worse than the general had imagined. A white woman had committed fraud to protect his left shield. The implications are staggering. Brossard brought the document directly to Genoa. He presented to barely concealed triumph, vindication of freeze which he had harbored about the mistress and her natural attachment to the safe boy. The Genoa's reaction was not what Brossard expected. He did it rage. He did it threat. He simply looked at the document for a long time, his face readable. Leafs, he said faintly. Brossard hesitated. He had expected rewards, praise, perhaps advancement in his position. Instead, he was being dismissed like a serf. Sir, surely you? Leave now. Brossard left. The general sat alone with the document in his hands. He thought about his wife. He thought about their marriage. He thought about the life that had built together on the backs of this left people. And he thought about Tobias. What happened in that room and the years that followed would never be fully documented. But when the general came at the next morning, he gave orders that surprised everyone on the plantation. Tobias would stay. The document would be destroyed. And no one would ever speak of this matter again. Why the general made this decision is one of the enduring mysteries of the story. Perhaps he feared scandal. Perhaps he left his wife despite freezing. Perhaps he saw something in Tobias that intrigued him, some echo of the abilities Marie Celeste had recognized years earlier. Or perhaps he understood on some level that the system he depended on was crumbling, and that Kenan Stone she'd made somehow matter with the return of Finley Camp. Whatever his reasons, Tobias survived. But survival was only the beginning. The year 1888 brought no challenges and no opportunities. The international slave trade was officially abolished on January 1, meaning no more enslaved people could be legally imported from Africa. This did not end slavery. It did not significantly reduce the enslaved population, but it changed the economics of the system, making existing enslaved people more valuable and increased the incentives for breeding rather than abortage. It was intensified the desperation of those who saw no hope of change. Charles Destrehan had been building his network for 2 years. He had identified potential allies on plantations throughout the Durham coast. He had set up communication channels with American communities in the suburbs. He had studied the lessons of the harsh revolution and adapted them to local conditions. He was prepared for war. Tobias known of this. He had been isolated from the Slavic community since the year 1887, kept close to the men Hassan who from situations where he might hear dangerous information. Marie Celeste had become protective to the point of suffocation, in order to risk any situation that might hurt her fragile arrangement with the Genoa. But this couldn't last forever. In the summer of 1888, Tobias turned 11. He was grown quickly, his body length and renaissance was that made his continued role as a health servant increasingly hard to justify. The Genoa became pressure Marie Celeste saying him to feel work, or counter the boy was wasting his potential in domestic service. Marie Celeste resisted, but her influence was won. The biblical situation the household had shifted. The Genoa no longer courtesed her judgment on matters related to the enslaved population. Claimed Brossard had canned Baron's aftermath of the document and said, and he used that Baron constantly advocated for harsher treatment of all enslaved people, but especially of Tobias. The crisis came in August. A fever soared through the slave quarters, killing enslaved people in 2 weeks. Among the dead was a man named Thomas, who had served as the Genoa's person attendant for more than a decade. His death created a vacancy that needed to be filled. The Genoa chose Tobias. This decision was surprising for several reasons. The position of person attendant was one of the most privileged roles slash birth could hold. It required constant proximity to the master, access to brief spaces and brief conversations, and a level of trust that was rarely extended to anyone. كيف this position a mute shield or could respond verbal commands send the logic. But Destrehan Noel had his reasons. He had been watching Tobias for years. He had seen the predictions come true. He had observed the boy's intelligence, his composure, his ability to understand complex situations without speaking a word, and he had begun to wonder if maybe Tobias might prove useful in ways no one had anticipated. What Destrehan Noel didn't know is that Tobias had been watching him too. Every email he served, every conversation offered, every document that passed through his hands, Tobias remembered the phrase. He built a picture of Destrehan Noel Destrehan's business dealings, his political connections, his fears and ambitions and secrets. He knew which neighbors Destrehan Noel trusted and which he despised. He knew the state of the plantation's finances. He knew the names of the men in New Orleans who had power over the territory. And he knew that Destrehan Noel was afraid. The fear was subtle, feasible only to someone who had spent years around trade union expressions. But it was there, reckoned beneath the confidence and authority. Destrehan Noel felt the left people he owned. He felt the changes coming to Louisiana. He felt that a fleece he had bit might be swapped were in the kind of field of people that had consumed and dominated. This fear made him dangerous. Frightened men do desperate sinners. They lash out. They overreact. They destroy what they cannot control. Tobias understood this, and I understood that his survival depended on navigator Destrehan Noel's fear without requiring the fearless to contend. The autumn of 1888 was deceptively peaceful. The sugar half stoned smoothly. No major storms disrupted the process. Breezes remained strong. Destrehan Noel's fortune continued to grow. But beneath the surface, forces were chasm. Charles Destrehan had completed his network. He had recruited allies on plantations from the plastic canner. He had stockpiled weapons, had them in the swamps where the Morons lived. He had developed a plan, a detailed strategy for seizure control of New Orleans and establish a free black republic in Louisiana. Their flush would come. Not this year, not the next, but soon. And when it came, Tobias would be forced to choose between the family that had sheltered him and the people who shared his chains, between survival and justice, between the impossible if he had built and the impossible future that waited. This is where the first part of Tobias' story ends. But the story itself is far from over. In 1811, when the German coast exploded in the largest cipher fought in American history, Tobias would be there. He would witness another history has trade forget. He would make choices that would hold him for the rest of his life. And the Destrehan Plantation, where he had lived his impossible existence as a black boy in a white man's world, would become a seat of a tribune that would sentence dozens of freedom fighters to death. But that is a story for another time. The year 1889 began with death. On January 30, a code fell across the German coast, turning the road that made the fields swamps. That morning, Maurice troubled Lockney Destrehan was a fever that would not break. By fun, she could no longer recognize her own chiller. By midnight, she was calm. Tobias was not permitted to attend the funeral. He stood at the window of the kitchen dependency, watching from a distance as the white mourners gathered around the grave. He saw Destrehan Noel, his face rigid with grief he could express. He saw the distraught children, confused and fated by the sad absence of their mother. He saw the neighbor planters, men like Jacques Fortier and Manuel Ondra, offer condolences that meant nothing. And he felt some regret inside him. Marie Celeste had been many sinners. She had been a slaveholder, a beneficiary of a system plutonium sufferer. She had been complicit in trustees she could have opposed the choice to know. She had owned the owners and profited from their labor. But she had also been the only person who had ever treated Tobias as fully human. She had taught him to read. She had taught him to write. She had given him the tools to understand the world that imprisoned him. Without her, he would have been just another anonymous body in the machinery of the plantation, worked until broken and discord. Because of her, he was something else. Something the system was never meant to create. An educated slave, a witness, a recorder of truth from an haunted buried. In the weeks after Marie Celeste's death, a freezer changed. Gino treated into grief and liquor. He sobbed manager the plantation directly, leave daily operations to kilometer solved. He sobbed tender social functions. He sobbed care about the details that had once consumed hesitation. Brosod says this opportunity was an immense, he had reorganized the entire labor system of the destroyed poverty. Workers increased. Rashes decreased. Benchmarks to become more frequent and more severe. While slave population, which had experienced a relatively moderate regime under Gino's direct superficie, now faced the full brutality of a man who saw them as nothing more than tools be used and broke. Tobias' position became precarious. Without Marie Celeste protection, he had no defender in the household. Gino barely acknowledged his existence. Wilder has represented him for his years of privilege, and Brosod had never forgot the humiliation of being dismissed when he discovered the fraudulent document. The officer began a campaign of deliberate cruelty. He sent Tobias the most degraded tasks, cleaned chamber boots, disposal of waste, working in conditions no has served would normally face. He made sure Tobias was always hungry, always exhausted, always reminded of his true place in the hierarchy. But he could not break him. This was what infuriated Brosod most. Their enslaved people, when subjected to this treatment, eventually collapsed. Their spirit shattered. They became complete, submissive, broken though as the system required. Tobias did not break. He performed the free tasks sent to him. He endured the free humiliation. He accepted the free punishment without complaint, without resistance, without any retort sign of the rage that burned inside him. And a free night, in the darkness of his sable space, hero. He had a bubber and been selling bliss Brosod would never sink search. He recorded the freeze, the names of the slave people on the plantation, the punishments they received, the deaths that occurred, the cruelties that went unwitnessed by anyone who may care. He was created a record, a document of suffering, a testament to the places like the Destrehan Plantation, where human behavior as property and their burden was considered relative. He didn't know what he would do with this record. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it. But that afraid kept him back. It reminded him he was more than what they said he was. He kept believe this book Marie Celeste had ignited. And it connected him to something larger than himself. The summer of 1809 brought Tobias back into contact with Charles Destrehan. It had the door of one of the Gino's rare ventures outside the plantation. Business required him to visit Manuel Andres' property, and he brought Tobias alone, of habit more than a tunch. The boy had served as his attendant for nearly a year, and Gino had grown accustomed to his sailor praises. At Andres' plantation, Tobias was left to witness the slave quarters where the workmen conducted their affairs. It was there that Destrehan found him. The revolutionary had changed in the 3 years since their first meeting. He was older now, harder, his face more to be accumulated weight of plans and water. But they still had the same fear to be remembered. I heard about your mistress, Destrehan said quietly, positioning himself so that the bit was left engaged in casual conversation. I heard she was called Theo. Tobias nodded. Called the relative, Destrehan continued. She owned you. She profited from your suffering. She could have freed you but chose not it. That is not codence. That is it safe. Tobias had no response to this. He had thought the same thing as himself in the dark years after Marie Celeste's death. He had wrestled with the contradiction of mourning someone who had been both his teacher and his jailer. But I did not come to discuss the dead, Destrehan said. I came to discuss the life. And the future. I glanced around, confirmed no one was close enough to overhear. Another change around the coast. Then America's ortator their curb. The planters are cat more afraid. An afraid man make mistakes. Tobias listened. When the time comes, Destrehan said, there will be a choice. Every self-birth on this coast will have to decide. Stay and submit. Or raise and fate. He looked directly at Tobias. You are different from the others. You live in the big house. You see a field hands in a farce. You know sinners that could be useful. Tobias understood what was being asked. Destrehan wanted information. He wanted us be inside the Destrehan household, someone who could report on the planters' plans and movements. But Tobias also understood the danger. If he was caught by the information Destrehan, this would be the kind of punishment he could expect. He hesitated. Destrehan read the hesitation correctly. I'm not asking you to decide now, he said. I'm asking you to remember that the choice exists. When you are ready, find a way to contact me. Until then, watch. Less. Learn. I'm off the before Tobias could respond. But the conversation had planted a seed. The autumn of 1809 brought a no breezes to the Destrehan Plantation. Her name was Celestine, and she raised as a board of a crop of slave people purchased from a fellow plantation near Baton Rouge. She was 16, tall and strong, with a fierce intelligence she had learned behind a mask of compliance. She was sent to the kitchen, where she worked alongside the older woman who prepared meals for the white family. Her duties brought her into regular contact with Tobias, who still carried food from the kitchen to the men's. At first they didn't speak. Tobias couldn't speak, and Celestine had read that Silas was surfer than conversation. But over the weeks that followed, a form of communication developed between them. Glances, gestures, visit language of people who share a common bondage. Celestine had come from a plantation where resistance was calm. She had seen escaped Tobias. She had witnessed punishments. She had known people who had died rather than submit. And she carried within her a burning hatred for the system that had stolen her freedom. When she learned that Tobias could read and write, a research changed. It was in her said that. She found one of his papers, a scrap on which she had been recorded as weeks offense. She confronted him in the darkness behind the kitchen, her face a fierce sober. You can wait. Tobias nodded, terrified she would expose him. But Celestine did not expose him. Instead, she made a request. Teach me. The lessons became a secret, conducted in still moments on both sides to show the swear. Tobias used this message Marie Celeste had used to him, scratch her letters in the dirt, kidder Celestine's hand from the ship that represented sand. She learned quickly, more quickly than Tobias had learned, drift by the urgency had it possessed door of his years of relative comfort. Within 3 months, she could read simple words. Within 6 months, she could read her own name. This accomplishment might seem small. In a world where literacy was calm, learned rate was not barely registered as achievement. But in the world of the Louisiana sugar plantation, it was revolutionary. Celestine had claimed ownership of herself in a way they need. She had let herself into existence. She had become more than property. And she was on a cry for more. The year 1810 بدوس rumors. Word spread through the communities of the German coast that something was coming. No one knew exactly what. No one knew exactly where. But the atmosphere had changed. There was electricity in the air, a sense of cover force that if the most excited workers could feel. Charles Destrehan had accelerated his plans. The reasons were complex. The miracle sorties or implemented no restrictions that would make future work easier more difficult. Several key rallies had been sold to plantations that said the ridge, weakened the network. And the political situation in New Orleans was becoming increasingly unstable, created opportunities that might not last. The flush would come in January 1811. It would be the largest fought in American history, and it would fail. But in early 1810, no one knew how the story would end. Tobias received his first direct message from Destrehan in March. It came through Celestine, who had connections to enslaved workers on neighboring plantations through invisible networks that linked to the enslaved communities. The message was simple, which they refer. Report to TOC. Tobias began watching. From his position in Manhattan, he had access to information from enslaved people could obtain. He saw the correspondence de journalists from other planters. He offered conversations about militia movements and security measures. He learned which needs the battles would be lost and which routes were less touched. This information flowed through Celestine contacts on other plantations, who passed it along to Destrehan and his network. Tobias was not ASB. The moral implications of this decision haunted him. He was betraying the people who had sheltered him, the family that had, in their own story, protected him from the worst fates awaiting enslaved children. He was putting himself at risk of torture and death. He was a contributor to plans that would almost certainly result in fields. But he was also doing something else. He was Satan. For the first time in his life, he was not merely survive. He was not simply enduring. He was actively working toward a future that might be different from the present. The feeling was intoxicating. The summer of 1810 brought General Destrehan of his long mourn. He had spent nearly 18 months lost in grief and regret. But something had finally shifted. Perhaps the passage of time had led the way. Perhaps the practical demands of running a plantation had become impossible to ignore. Perhaps he had simply grown tired of feeling broke. Whatever the reason, he began asserting control. His first act was it summoned Tobias. I have been watching you, the general said, his face rusty from months of disuse. You have changed. Tobias stood silently, his face carefully balanced. My wife believed you had gifts, abilities that set you aboard. I dismissed her beliefs as sentimentality. I paused. I was wrong. The general leaned forward. 3 times in the past months, you have done things that cannot be explained. You moved a stack of papers from my desk before a window shattered in a storm no one predicted. You positioned yourself near the door when a visitor arrived hours before anyone could have known he was coming. You avoided the bus where a sack was hidden. A snake that bit the man who was behind you. He stared at Tobias with intensity that made the boy want to flee. What are you? Tobias could not answer. He couldn't answer in words. But he understood what the general was asking. And he understood the danger of the question. If the general believed Tobias had supernatural abilities, he might try to exploit them. He might become dependent on Tobias's predictions, elevate the boy to a position of unprecedented influence. This could provide protection and opportunity. Or it could make Tobias too fallible to ignore. It could draw attention from neighbors, from authorities, from people who would want on a slave with such abilities for themselves. It could turn Tobias from a person to a brace. He made a decision. He shirked. A simple gesture. A denier of an is extraordinary. Just coincidence. Just luck. Just a slave who happened to be in the right place at the right time. The general studied him for a long moment. Perhaps, he said faintly, 'tis Nasa. But as he suggested he did not believe it. The autumn of 1810 brought the final pieces of this plan into place. The reflush would begin on January 8, 1811. It would start at the plantation of Manuel Ondra, where Destrehan worked as a driver. The rebels would seize webs, kill or wound Inuits who resisted, and march then refer toward New Orleans. Long as well, they would recruit additional fighters from the free plantations the past. The call was not merely to escape. The call was to conquer. Destrehan envisioned a free black republic in Louisiana, modeled on Haiti. He planned to capture New Orleans, seize the government buildings, and establish a new order. It was an audacious siege, almost certainly impossible if the military forces were against him. But impossible things sometimes happen. Tobias learned of the plan in December. Celestine brought him the details, her fist was a mix of fear and excitement. It will happen in January, she said, after the holidays, when the weather so relaxed and the betrothals are dust. How many? Tobias just shared, asking about the number of rabbis. Hundreds, maybe more. Every plantation on the coast has people ready to join. Tobias processed this information. Hundreds of enslaved people raised simultaneously to their masters. It was unprecedented in American history. It was also, he calculated, almost certainly dumb. He had seen the militia records in the general study. He knew how many armed white could be mobilized as honors. He understood the fear bar the American sorties could burn it bear. Their rebels had courage. They had numbers. They had justice on their side. But they did not have guns. He tried to communicate this to Celestine. He tried to explain that the mathematics of the situation did not favor the rebels. He tried to suggest that perhaps the plan should be reconsidered, that perhaps there were better ways fit for freedom. Celestine listened. The she spoke words Tobias would never forget. If we wait for the perfect moment, we will wait forever. If we only fit battles we can win, we will never fit at all. Sometimes you have a streak, even you know you might fail, because the alternative is to accept the free forever. She was right, and Tobias knew she was right. But none did not make the camera feel any easier to contemplate. The morning of January 8, 1811, dawn could anchor. Tobias woke before dawn, as he always did. He dressed in the darkness, prepared for another day of service in the household of the General Destrehan. He had no way of knowing that this would be one of the most important days in American history. The first thing that Samus was around the camera in the morning. A rider appeared on the river road. His horse was lathered with salt, his face twisted with panic. He demanded to see the General immediately. Tobias, who was attending his duties in the main house, positioned himself where he could overhear the conversation. In Syracuse, the rider gasped. At Untold Plantation. This was the phrase. They killed Untold's son. They wounded Untold himself. They were murdered this way. The General's face went white. How many? Dozens, maybe hundreds. They are gathered more as their march. They have weapons. They have drums. They are organized. For a moment, no one moved. The reality of this situation was too enormous to process. If least of the planters had feared, if least they had tried to prevent so fearless and control and the constant rush of white supremacy, was happening. This last or fater back. The General recovered first. San word to New Orleans. Alert the militia. An armed free white man on this property. The next suffer levels or chaos. Tobias watched as the General organized the defense of the Destrehan Plantation. White men gathered with muskets and pistols. Slave workers were locked in the quarters, guarded beyond overseers. The road was barricaded. Preparations were made for either fight or flight. And throughout it all, Tobias felt a strange double consciousness. Both of him was terrified. If the rebels succeeded in reaching the Destrehan property, Phyllis would follow. People would die. The world he knew would be destroyed. But neither both of them felt Samus entirely. However, for the first time in his life, the system that enslaved him was being challenged. For the first time, the people who had been treated as property were acted as agents of their own destiny. For the first time, the impossible was become possible. He found Celestine in the confusion of the morning. It has begun, she whispered. Tobias nodded. Will you go? Will you join them? He had thought about this question for weeks. He had imagined himself marching alongside a sled, fighter for freedom with whatever rebels he could find. He had dreamed of being rebought of their affluence, of helping to build the world the rebels envisioned. But he had also thought about Samus race. Someone needed their faith. Someone needed to remember what happened here. Someone needed to record the truth so future generations would know that their ancestors had fought, that they had not accepted slavery passively, that they had been willing that day for freedom. Tobias just told them in his. I will study. I will watch. I will remember. Celestine understood. Then I will go, she said. I will fight. She touched his face once, a gesture of farewell. Then she stepped into the chaos, headed toward the road where the rebels were about to show. Tobias never saw her again. The 4th of January 1811 lasted less than 3 days. Shoals descended led between 200 and 500 rebels though the road, recruit traditional fighters from free plantations the best. They carried knives, axes, and pikes. They had captured a few firearms from the Untold plantation, but not nearly enough. They marched to drums, organized into units, disciplining a rifle of coordination that terrified the population. They burned plantation houses. They destroyed crops. They killed 2 white men who tried to resist. And they came within the sun maze of New Orleans. But the response was overwhelming. Governor William C. Claiborne mobilized the territorial militia. The General Woodhambe, one of the largest slaveholders in the country, led 2 companies of volunteers. The United States Army and Navy contributed additional forces. Within 48 hours, nearly 700 armed soldiers were converged on the rebels from multiple directions. The final confrontation occurred on the morning of January 10 near the plantation of Jock Fortier. The rebels had marched through the night, cordons and crayon and low ammunition. They had hoped to reach New Orleans before the military could organize. They had hoped slave people in the city would raise to join them. They had hoped the impossible might somehow become real. But hope was not enough. The militia attacked at dawn. The rebels fought with extraordinary courage, holding their ground against enemies with superior weapons and time. But the outcome was never in that. When the battle ended, dozens of rebels lay dead. Others had scattered into the swamps, hoping to escape into the maroon communities that hid in the wilderness. The rest were captured, burned, and prepared for the judgment that awaited them. Charles descended was among those who fled. He ran into the swamps behind the picket and took several plantations, hoping to disappear into the vast wetlands where he had once organized his network. But he was hunted, tracked by dogs and soldiers through the mud and water until he could run no more. When they captured him, they did not take him to try. His owner, a man who shared the Destrehan's name, was buried when Charles was brought before the militia. The execution that followed was designed to send a message. They chopped off his hands. They shot him in one side, then the other, shattered the bones. They shot him in the body. And before he died, while he was still conscious and streamed, they blessed him in a bale of straw and set on fire. His day in the crazy could across the swamps, her base kept rebels hidden in the darkness. The message was clear: this is what happens when you fight back. Tobias witnessed the aftermath. He was buried at the Destrehan Plantation on January 13, when the tribune confined the judge captured rebels. The General Destrehan's property had been selected as the site for one of 3 simultaneous trials, a decision that reflected both his prominence in the community and the proximity of his plantation to the root of the rebellion. The tribunal was a mockery of justice. 60 enslaved people were brought on trial across the 3 proceedings. The evidence against them consisted largely of accusations from white witnesses and confessions extracted through torture. The defendants had no lawyers. They had no opportunity to present their own testimony. The outcome was predetermined before the first word was spoken. At Destrehan, 21 men were condemned to death. Tobias knew some of them. He had passed information to their networks. He had contributed in a small way to the plans of their revolt. And he stood in the shadows of the great house, watching as men were sentenced to die for seeking the freedom that he was so craving. The executions began on January 15. Each condemned man was taken to the plantation where he had been enslaved. He was shown in front of the assembled workers, a spectacle designed to raise the survivors into submission. Then his body was decapitated, and his head was mounted on a bully on the road. By the time the executions were complete, nearly 100 heads lined the road from New Orleans to the sea therefore. The display was intended as a warning. Look what happens when you resist. Look what happens when you dream of freedom. Look what happens when you forget your place. But for Tobias, the display meant something different. Each head was a human being. Each head had a name, a history, a network of relationships and hopes and fears. Each head represented someone who had chosen fate rather than submit, trust this rather than accept in this bondage. Each head was a hero. And Tobias was determined that their heroism would not be forgot. In the weeks after their fight, Tobias became the most dangerous project of his life. Hij wrote a freeze working in stole moments, hij his interiors in places no one would search. He created a record of what had happened. He documented the names of the rabbis, as many as he could. He described the tribunal, the mockery of justice that had condemned honest men alongside the actual participants. He recorded the executions, the display of heads, the terror that kept the germ cost in the aftermath of the reprisal. He wrote about Charles Destrehan. He wrote about the fight of freedom that had motivated their fight. He wrote about the courage of people who had known they would probably die but had chosen fate in you. And he wrote about Celestine. He never learned what happened to her. She had disappeared into the chaos of their fight, joined the rebels as the march toward New Orleans. She might have died in the battle. She might have been captured and executed. She might have escaped into the swamps, left remnants as Mronzo continued to resist. But whatever her fate, Tobias refused to let her be forgot. He wrote her name. He described her courage. He recorded the lessons she had taught him about resistance and hope and the necessity of faith. If victory seemed impossible, she had changed him. She had shown him that their faith was not enough, that there were censors therefore. And she had given him a purpose. The document Tobias created the months after their fight was an echoes of that existed at the time. It was a self-narrative rebel self-birth, recorded offenses they had rather than being reflected years later in freedom. It was a primary source of extraordinary historical value, documenting the largest ever fight in American history from the perspective of someone who had this role. But it was also a fact. If the document was discovered, Tobias would face torture and death. If the names they had recorded were trusted their sources, their slave people would suffer. If the information he had gathered was connected to the plans of their fight, their attribution would extend far beyond his own benchmark. He had the document carefully. He buried sections of it in different locations around the plantation. He encoded bushes using a cipher Marie Celeste had taught him years earlier. He created multiple copies, storing them in places where they might survive if he did not. And then he waited. The years that followed their fight were the darkest of Tobias's life. The authorities implemented brutal no restrictions on the slave population. Movement was limited. Caverns were prohibited. Punishments for the smallest infractions became severe. The atmosphere of terror the planters had created was designed to ensure that نسر like the 1811 fight would never happen again. General Destrehan died in 1823. His death brought changes to the plantation Tobias had called home for nearly 2 decades. The property passed to owners who had no connection to the strange boy who had once lived in the mansion. Tobias was sold. He passed through several hands over the following years, moving from plantation to plantation across Louisiana. Each sale was a new tomb, a reminder that he was a property, that his body and his labor belonged to whoever held his beloved soul. But he carried some of him that could not be sold. He carried the stories. He carried the names of the rebels. He carried the memory of Celestine's courage. He carried the words Charles Destrehan had spoken years earlier about the choice of free slave birth would eventually fails. And he carried the knowledge that resistance was possible. He taught that knowledge to others. Wherever he was sold, he found ways to connect with the slave communities around him. He shared what he knew about trade and later. Hij best lovende techniques of organisatie dessen had developed. هكذا باللي في زمامري في 1811 تلف ستوريتين ربيب بولها هاد بول افتر زرفوت انو نسغا فوزر براد سسز هاد تمت. The document had created was a functionally coupled. Not in his lifetime, not for many generations. But fragments of it survived, had in the places where he had buried them, preserved by the exit of history that led some sinners to doorway lasers or destroyed. When historians finally pieced together the story of the German Costa Breezes, they found references to a slave person who had lived in the Destrehan, a mute boy who had witnessed the tribune and recorded what he saw. The references were fragmentary, incomplete, tantalizer glimpses of a story that could never be fully reconstructed. But they were enough. They were enough to know that Tobias had existed. They were enough to know that he had fought in his own wood, using the only weapons available to him. They were enough to know that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings found ways to resist, to preserve truth, to serve their humanity against systems designed to deny. The Destrehan Plantation still stands today. Visitors can tour the restored buildings, walk through the suburbs where the Nolan Marisela once lived, see the quarters where the slave people were housed. The Plantation hosts education programs about the history itself, including exhibits about the 1811 foot and the tribune that took place on its grounds. But what the official tours cannot show is the full story. They cannot show the secret lessons that took place in the corridor when a white woman taught a black child trade. They cannot show the hidden documents buried locations that have never been found. They cannot show the network of communication that linked enslaved communities across the German coast. The invisible infrastructure of resistance that made their fight possible. And they cannot show Tobias. His name does not appear in their official records. His story was not preserved in the archive historians consult. He was arrested, as a countless enslaved people were arrested. His existence deemed unworthy of documentation by the people who controlled the historical record. But erasure is not the same as destruction. Tobias lives. Tobias witnessed. Tobias recorded. And through the fragments that survived, through the stories that were passed down, through the evidence that emerged from unearthly sources, his testimony endured. The lessons of his life were not simple. He was saved by slaveholder, educated by oppressor, sheltered by people who profited from the suffering of his people. He survived by hated, by dissembled, by pretended to be less than he was. He made compromises that troubled his conscience. He chose safety over solidarity in moments that haunted him for the rest of his life. But he also fought. He fought with the only weapons he possessed. He fought by learning, by teaching, by preserving truth. He fought by refusing to accept the lies the system told about him. He fought by remembering the names of the forgotten, by honoring the courage of the fallen, by bearing witness to justice powerful man wanted buried. His fate did not ensure free. It did not free a cynical birth. It did not change the immediate circumstances of his own bondage. But it mattered. It mattered because truth matters. It mattered because memory matters. It mattered because the struggle for justice does not end when one generation falls but continues through the next. Carried forward by those who refused to forget. Charles Destrehan understood this. When he led خمس مع people into the most powerful genres, he knew how would probably fall. He knew the mathematics were against him, that the weapons were insufficient, that the forces read in opposition were overwhelming. But he also knew that the act of resistance itself had value. He knew his rebellion would be remembered, that it would inspire future generations, that it would prove that enslaved people were not the docile properties of holders pretended them to be. He was right. The German Costa Breeze of 1811 was suppressed with terrible feels. Its leaders were executed. Its participants were massacred. Its cause were not achieved, but it was not defeated. The memory of the Breeze left on the enslaved communities of Louisiana. It inspired future resistance. It contributed to the abolitionist movement that would eventually challenge slavery throughout the United States. It demonstrated that freedom was worth daily for, that human beings would not accept bondage forever, that the system of the African tendons and sells the seeds of its own destruction. And the story continued. 50 years after their fought, the Safel were erupted. Slaved people throughout the Safladit Uni lanes, fought in the Uni army, contributing countless ways to the destruction of the system that had oppressed them. When a man Sabash finally came, it came about because of the resistance that had been built for generations. The accumulated pressure of millions of people who refused to accept that they were property. The rebels of 1811 were bought that pressure. Their sacrifice mattered. Their courage mattered. Their well against fate mattered. And Tobias, the new boy who lived in the mansion, opens the tribunal, or recorded the truth, was about of that story, too. His life spanned the darkest period of America's history. He was born into bondage, left his entire existence as property, dead without ever experience of freedom. Beacon function majors, his existence was a tragedy, defined by suffering and the constant denial of his humanity. But convention majors do not capture the whole truth. Tobias preserved some repressions. He carried the stories of people who would otherwise have been forgotten. He kept the flame of resistance alive through decades of darkness. He proved that even the most oppressive circumstances, the human spirit could find ways to itself, fight back, to refuse surrender. This is the loss of his impossible life. Not that resistance always succeeds, not that courage is always rewarded, not that justice always triumphs, but that resistance matters anew. That courage has value beyond its practical results. That justice is worth a person when victory seems impossible. The boy who was found asleep over the Destrehan Mansion 1804 should not have survived. He should not have been educated. He should not have authentically been mad. He should not have left any trace of his existence. But he did. He surfaced against all odds. He learned what he was forbidden to learn. He saw what a powerful man wanted had. And he ensured that the truth would outlast his lies. That is his legacy. That is what makes his story worth telling. And that is why, more than 10 years later, we still speak his name. Tobias, the impossible boy who lived. The witness who remembered. The face that could not be silenced.